Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who noticed things others missed. As a paramedic in the bustling city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read situations quickly. Her colleagues often joked that she could smell trouble from miles away, but Sarah knew it was just years of experience and an overdeveloped sense of responsibility that kept her constantly alert. On that particular Tuesday evening in late October, Sarah was driving home from her shift at Tulsa General Hospital. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves, and the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. She had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her cat, Milo, and perhaps catching up on the mystery novel she had been trying to finish for weeks. As she turned onto Maple Street, a residential area filled with modest two-story homes, Sarah noticed something that made her foot instinctively move toward the brake pedal. Smoke was rising from one of the houses at the end of the block, and it wasn't the gentle curl of chimney smoke that should accompany the cool October weather. This was thick, dark, and urgent. Sarah pulled over immediately and grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as she stepped out of her car. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the urgency in her own voice as she reported the address and what she was seeing. The smoke was getting thicker, and now she could see the orange glow of flames through one of the downstairs windows. As she approached the house, Sarah noticed an elderly man standing in the front yard, his face streaked with soot, and his hands shaking as he gestured wildly at the burning building. She ran toward him, her paramedic training taking over completely. "Sir, are you hurt? Is anyone else in the house?" she called out as she reached him. The man, who appeared to be in his 70s, grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "My granddaughter," he gasped, pointing toward the second floor. "Emma's up there. She was taking a nap in her room. I tried to get to her, but the stairs are blocked. The fire started in the kitchen and spread so fast." Sarah looked up at the second-floor windows and saw a small face pressed against the glass of what must have been the child's bedroom. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and even from the ground, Sarah could see the terror in her eyes. The little girl was banging on the window, her mouth open in what Sarah knew must be desperate screams for help. "The fire department is on the way," Sarah told the grandfather, though she knew that in a situation like this, every second counted. The smoke was getting thicker, and she could see that the flames had already reached the staircase inside the house. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Sarah ran toward the house and began looking for another way to reach the second floor. She had no firefighting equipment, no protective gear, and no backup, but she couldn't stand there and watch a child die while waiting for help to arrive. Behind the house, Sarah found an old wooden ladder lying in the overgrown garden. It looked like it had been there for years, weathered and possibly unreliable, but it was her only option. She dragged it toward the house, struggling with its weight and the urgency of the situation. The heat from the fire was becoming more intense as she positioned the ladder against the side of the house, directly below what she hoped was Emma's bedroom window. The ladder barely reached the windowsill, and Sarah knew that climbing it would be dangerous under the best circumstances. With a fire raging inside the house and the structure potentially compromised, it could be a death sentence. But as she looked up and saw the little girl's face in the window, surrounded by smoke that was getting thicker by the minute, Sarah knew she had no choice. She had become a paramedic because she wanted to save lives, and that's exactly what she was going to do. Sarah began climbing the ladder, each rung creaking ominously under her weight. The heat from the fire made the metal rungs almost too hot to touch, and the smoke was making it difficult to breathe. Halfway up, she could hear sirens in the distance, but she knew they wouldn't arrive in time. When she reached the window, Sarah found that it was locked from the inside. The little girl was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Sarah could see that the child's room was filling with smoke, and she knew that time was running out. Using her elbow, Sarah broke the window, sending shards of glass falling to the ground below. The little girl jumped back, startled by the sudden noise and the appearance of a stranger at her window. "Emma, I'm here to help you," Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay? You need to come with me right now." The child hesitated for a moment, clearly frightened not just by the fire, but by the strange woman who had appeared at her window. Sarah could see the internal struggle on the girl's face, the natural wariness of a child who had been taught not to go with strangers, warring against the obvious danger of staying where she was. "Your grandfather sent me," Sarah said, hoping that would help convince the girl to trust her. "He's waiting for you outside. He's safe, and I'm going to make sure you're safe too." Emma nodded and moved toward the window, but as she did, Sarah could see that the smoke in the room was getting much thicker. The child was coughing, and Sarah knew that smoke inhalation could be just as deadly as the fire itself. "We need to go now," Sarah said, reaching through the broken window to help Emma climb out. Put your arms around my neck and hold on tight. Don't let go, no matter what. As Emma climbed onto Sarah's back, Sarah could feel the child trembling with fear. The little girl was lighter than Sarah had expected, but carrying her down the ladder while the fire raged around them would still be incredibly dangerous. Sarah began her descent, moving as quickly as she dared while trying to keep both herself and Emma safe. The ladder wobbled with their combined weight, and the heat from the fire was becoming almost unbearable. She could feel Emma's arms tightening around her neck, and she could hear the child's quiet sobs in her ear. Halfway down, one of the ladder's rungs cracked under the pressure, and Sarah felt her foot slip. For a terrifying moment, she thought they were both going to fall, but she managed to catch herself and continued down. Her hands were burning from gripping the hot metal rungs, and her lungs felt like they were on fire from the smoke, but she kept moving. When they finally reached the ground, Sarah's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the grass with Emma still clinging to her back. The fire department had arrived, and she could hear the voices of firefighters and paramedics calling out instructions to each other. Sarah rolled over and looked at Emma, who was coughing but appeared to be unharmed. The little girl's face was streaked with soot, and her long black hair was tangled, but her dark eyes were bright and alert. There was something about those eyes that struck Sarah as unusual, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, gently checking Emma for injuries while they waited for the paramedics to reach them. Emma nodded, though she was still coughing from the smoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos around them. "You saved me." As the paramedics took over Emma's care, Sarah sat on the grass and watched the firefighters work to control the blaze. The house was a total loss, she could see that much, but they had gotten Emma out alive, and that was what mattered. Emma's grandfather approached Sarah, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Emma is everything to me. Her parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, and she's been living with me ever since." If something had happened to her, Sarah stood up and placed a comforting hand on the old man's shoulder. "She's safe," she said simply. "That's what's important." As the emergency responders continued their work, Sarah learned more about the family she had helped save. The grandfather's name was James Blackhorse, and he had been raising Emma since her parents' death. They had been planning to renovate the old house, which was why the ladder had been in the backyard, but the electrical system had been faulty, and a short circuit in the kitchen had started the fire. What struck Sarah most about the interaction was how grateful James seemed, but also how there was something almost formal about the way he spoke to her. It wasn't unfriendliness, exactly, but there was a dignity and a careful precision to his words that suggested a cultural background different from her own. Emma, too, seemed different from other children Sarah had encountered in her work. Despite the trauma of the fire, the little girl carried herself with a quiet strength that seemed unusual for someone so young. When she spoke, which wasn't often, her words were carefully chosen, and there was a maturity in her expression that spoke of experiences beyond her years. As the night wore on and the fire was finally brought under control, Sarah gave her contact information to James and Emma, telling them to call if they needed anything. She had no idea that this simple act of heroism would lead to discoveries that would change not only her understanding of the family she had saved, but also her understanding of herself and the community she had always called home. The local news crews arrived as Sarah was preparing to leave, and she found herself reluctantly agreeing to a brief interview about the rescue. She had never been comfortable with attention or praise, preferring to do her job quietly and go home, but the reporter was persistent, and James had specifically asked her to tell the story so that others might be inspired to help their neighbors. As Sarah drove home that night, her hands still bearing the marks of the hot ladder rungs and her clothes still smelling of smoke, she couldn't stop thinking about Emma's eyes. There had been something hauntingly familiar about them, though she was certain she had never met the child before. It was as if some part of her recognized something in the little girl, a connection that went deeper than the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. She also found herself thinking about James Blackhorse and the way he had spoken about Emma's parents. There had been a sadness in his voice that went beyond the immediate grief of potentially losing his granddaughter. It was the kind of deep, generational sadness that Sarah had heard before in her work with families who had experienced not just personal loss, but cultural displacement and historical trauma. Sarah had grown up in Tulsa, but she realized that despite living in a city with a significant Native American population, she knew very little about the communities and cultures that had shaped the region's history. Her rescue of Emma had opened a door to questions she had never thought to ask, and she found herself curious about the family she had helped and the broader community they belonged to. Over the next few days, Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on her regular work. She kept thinking about the fire, about Emma's brave face pressed against the window, and about the way James had looked at her with such profound gratitude. She had saved lives before in her work as a paramedic, but this felt different somehow, more personal and more significant. When her phone rang on Thursday evening, 3 days after the fire, Sarah was surprised to hear James Blackhorse's voice on the other end. He was calling to update her on Emma's condition and to invite her to visit them at the temporary housing the Red Cross had arranged. "Emma has been asking about you," James said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "She wants to thank you properly, and to be honest, I think it would help her process what happened. She's been having nightmares about the fire, but she also keeps talking about the angel lady who saved her." Sarah agreed to visit, touched by the invitation and curious to see how Emma was recovering from her ordeal. She had no way of knowing that this visit would begin a series of revelations that would transform her understanding of Cherokee history, Tulsa's past, and her own family's place in both stories. The Red Cross had set up James and Emma in a small but comfortable apartment in a complex that specialized in temporary housing for families displaced by emergencies. When Sarah arrived on Saturday afternoon carrying a bag of books and puzzles she thought might help Emma cope with the trauma, she was struck by how the modest space had already been transformed into something that felt like home. Native American artwork hung on the walls, and the scent of sage drifted from a small bundle burning in a ceramic bowl near the window. Emma was sitting at a small table, working on what appeared to be a beading project, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she threaded tiny glass beads onto a thin strand of sinew. "Sarah!" Emma exclaimed when she saw her, jumping up from the table and running to give her an enthusiastic hug. The little girl seemed completely transformed from the terrified child Sarah had carried down the ladder just days before. Her long black hair was neatly braided, and she wore a simple dress with intricate geometric patterns embroidered along the hem. James emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea and a plate of what looked like homemade cookies. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair near the window. "Emma has been working on something special for you." As they settled around the small living room, Emma proudly showed Sarah the beadwork she had been creating. It was a small medallion with a design that seemed to incorporate elements of fire and water, with flowing lines in red and blue beads that created a pattern both beautiful and meaningful. "Grandfather taught me how to bead when I was very little," Emma explained, her voice more confident than Sarah remembered from their first meeting. "This is a protection symbol. I made it for you because you protected me." Sarah was deeply moved by the gift, though she wasn't sure she understood its full significance. As she examined the intricate work, James began to explain more about their family's background and traditions. "Emma and I are Cherokee," he said, settling into his own chair with his tea. "Our family has been in this area for generations, though not always by choice. My great-grandmother was a survivor of the Trail of Tears, and my grandmother was born here in Indian Territory before it began." Sarah listened with growing interest as James told her about their family's history. She had learned about the Trail of Tears in school, but hearing about it from someone whose family had lived through it made the historical event feel immediate and personal in a way she had never experienced before. "My great-grandmother used to tell stories about the old days," James continued. "Before the removal, when our people lived in the mountains of North Carolina and Georgia. She said our family was connected to the tribal leadership, that we had responsibilities to our community that went back many generations." Emma, who had been listening quietly while working on another beading project, looked up at her grandfather with obvious pride. "Tell her about the princess story, grandfather," she said softly. James smiled at his granddaughter, but Sarah noticed that there was something almost hesitant about his expression. "Emma likes the old family stories," he said carefully. "Some of them might sound far-fetched to people who aren't familiar with Cherokee traditions and history." Sarah leaned forward, genuinely curious. "I'd love to hear whatever you're willing to share. I realize I know very little about Cherokee culture, and after meeting you and Emma, I'd like to learn more." James nodded slowly, as if making a decision about how much to reveal. "My great-grandmother's name was Mary Ridge Blackhorse. The Ridge family was prominent in Cherokee society before the removal. Her grandfather was Major Ridge, one of the Cherokee leaders who signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. Sarah's eyes widened. Even with her limited knowledge of Cherokee history, she recognized the name Major Ridge. He was one of the controversial figures who had agreed to Cherokee removal to the west, believing it was the only way to save the Cherokee people from complete destruction by white settlers and the U.S. government. Major Ridge was assassinated in 1839, soon after arriving in Indian Territory. James continued. The Cherokee had laws against unauthorized land cessions. and many people consider the treaty signers to be traitors. But my great-grandmother always maintained that her great-grandfather was trying to save as many Cherokee lives as possible. Emma had stopped beating and was listening to her grandfather's story with the rapt attention of a child who had heard these tales many times but never grew tired of them. Sarah could see that for Emma, these weren't just historical facts, but living family memories that connected her to a legacy much larger than herself. Mary Ridge Blackhorse was the great-granddaughter of Major Ridge, which means she was descended from Cherokee leadership, James explained. In traditional Cherokee society, that would have made her something like royalty, though we didn't use that exact term. She carried the responsibility of preserving our cultural knowledge and helping to guide our community through very difficult times. Sarah was beginning to understand that she had rescued not just any child, but someone whose family lineage connected her directly to some of the most significant events in Cherokee history. "So Emma is descended from Cherokee leaders?" she asked. "More than that," James said quietly. "According to our family traditions, Emma is the direct descendant of Cherokee chiefs and peace leaders going back many generations. In the old way of thinking about such things, that would make her something like Cherokee royalty, though of course those traditional systems don't function the same way in the modern world." Emma looked up from her beadwork with a shy smile. "Grandfather says I have responsibilities to learn the old stories and the old ways, so I can teach them to my children someday," she said. "That's why I'm learning to bead and to speak Cherokee, and to remember all the family histories." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the family's stories and traditions. James showed her photographs of relatives, including a remarkable portrait of Mary Ridge Blackhorse, taken sometime in the 1890s. The resemblance between Mary and Emma was striking, particularly in the eyes, which had the same depth and intelligence that Sarah had noticed in Emma during the fire. "Emma looks exactly like her great-great-grandmother," James observed, noticing Sarah's reaction to the photograph. "Sometimes I think she has Mary's spirit as well as her appearance. Emma has always been unusually mature for her age, and she has a way of understanding things that most children wouldn't." Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon learning about Cherokee history and culture from James and Emma. She discovered that the Cherokee had a complex political system with elected chiefs and a written constitution, that they had their own newspaper and educational institutions, and that they had been farming and living in permanent settlements for centuries before European contact. "Most people think of Native Americans as nomadic hunters," James explained. "But the Cherokee were agricultural people with sophisticated government systems and written laws. We had libraries and schools and courts. In many ways, Cherokee society was more democratic than the American society that displaced it." As evening approached and Sarah prepared to leave, Emma presented her with the completed beadwork medallion. "This is a protection symbol," she explained as she helped Sarah put it on. "Grandfather says that when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that person in a spiritual way. But I think it works both ways. I think you're responsible for me, and I'm responsible for you." James nodded approvingly at his granddaughter's words. In Cherokee tradition, when someone saves another person's life, it creates a bond that lasts forever. Emma is right that the responsibility goes both ways. You saved her life, but in doing so, you also became part of our family's story. As Sarah drove home that evening, she found herself thinking not just about Emma's Cherokee heritage, but about her own family's history in Oklahoma. Her grandparents had moved to Tulsa in the 1940s, and she had grown up thinking of herself as simply American, without much consideration for the complex cultural and historical forces that had shaped the region where she lived. She realized that her rescue of Emma had opened her eyes to a whole layer of local history and culture that she had been largely unaware of. The Cherokee weren't just historical figures from textbooks, but living people with ongoing communities and traditions, families like James and Emma who carried forward ancient knowledge and customs in the modern world. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself visiting James and Emma regularly. What had started as concern for Emma's recovery from the fire had evolved into genuine friendship and a growing fascination with Cherokee history and culture. Emma was thriving in her temporary housing, attending a local school and making new friends, but she clearly looked forward to Sarah's visits. During one visit, Sarah mentioned that she had been doing some research on Cherokee history online and had learned about the Cherokee Phoenix, the tribe's newspaper that had been published in both Cherokee and English in the 1820s and 1830s. "My ancestor, Elias Boudinot, was the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix," James said with obvious pride. He was Major Ridge's nephew, so he was Emma's great-great-great-uncle. He was also one of the treaty signers, and he was killed in 1839 along with Major Ridge. Sarah was amazed to discover that Emma's family tree included not just Cherokee political leaders, but also journalists and intellectuals who had played crucial roles in Cherokee efforts to maintain their independence and cultural identity. Elias Boudinot was educated at a mission school in Connecticut, James explained. He could read and write in English and Cherokee, and he used the Cherokee Phoenix to try to build support for Cherokee rights among white Americans. He believed that if white people understood Cherokee culture and achievements, they would oppose removal. Emma, who had been listening to this conversation while working on a new beading project, looked up with a thoughtful expression. Grandfather says that Elias Boudinot and Major Ridge were trying to save Cherokee people, but other Cherokee thought they were wrong to sign the treaty. It's complicated. Sarah was impressed by Emma's mature understanding of her family's complex history. The 8-year-old seemed to grasp that historical events were rarely simple matters of right and wrong, but involved difficult choices made by people trying to do their best in impossible circumstances. As winter settled over Tulsa and the holidays approached, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly involved in James and Emma's lives. She helped Emma with her homework, attended her school plays, and learned to appreciate Cherokee foods and customs. In return, James and Emma welcomed her into their small family circle with a warmth and generosity that touched Sarah deeply. It was during a casual conversation in late December that James made a remark that would send Sarah's understanding of her own identity into upheaval. They had been discussing Emma's school project on family genealogy when James mentioned that Sarah's features and coloring reminded him of people from his grandmother's generation. "Your cheekbones and the shape of your eyes," he said thoughtfully, studying Sarah's face. "You might have some Native American ancestry. Have you ever researched your family's genealogy?" Sarah laughed, thinking he was just being polite. "I'm pretty sure my family is just typical European American," she said. "My maiden name is Martinez, so there might be some Spanish heritage way back, but nothing as interesting as Cherokee royalty." But James's comment planted a seed of curiosity that Sarah found difficult to ignore. Over the Christmas break, she began researching her family's genealogy online, starting with her grandparents and working backward through census records and immigration documents. What she discovered would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her connection to the family she had saved from the fire. Sarah's genealogical research began as casual curiosity, but within hours of starting, she found herself pulled into a mystery that seemed to reach back generations. Her paternal grandmother, Maria Santos Martinez, had always been somewhat secretive about her family's background, claiming only that they had come from somewhere in the Southwest, and that many records had been lost. Using online genealogy databases and courthouse records, Sarah began to trace Maria's family back through New Mexico and Arizona Territory records from the late 1800s. What she found was unexpected. Her great-great-grandmother had been listed in some documents as Maria Santos Cherokee and in others as Maria Santos Mexican. Sarah sat at her kitchen table surrounded by printed documents and handwritten family trees, trying to make sense of what she was discovering. The more she researched, the more complex the picture became. Her great-great-grandmother seemed to have deliberately obscured her background, sometimes claiming Mexican heritage and sometimes listing no tribal affiliation at all. It wasn't until Sarah found a land allotment record from 1902 that the pieces began to fall into place. Maria Santos had received a land allotment from the U.S. government as part of the Dawes Act, which distributed tribal lands to individual Native Americans. The document clearly listed her as Cherokee by blood and included a roll number that connected her to the official Cherokee tribal enrollment records. Sarah's hands were shaking as she cross-referenced the roll number with Cherokee Nation records. Her great-great-grandmother, Maria Santos, had been enrolled as a Cherokee citizen, and her parents were listed as Juan Santos and Rising Dawn Ridge Santos. The surname Ridge made Sarah's heart race. She called James immediately, barely able to contain her excitement and confusion. "James, I think I need to show you something. Can I come over?" An hour later, Sarah was sitting in James and Emma's living room with her research spread out on the coffee table. James examined the documents with growing amazement, while Emma looked over his shoulder with wide eyes. "Rising Dawn Ridge Santos," James read aloud from one of the documents. Santos was a name that some Cherokee families adopted when they moved to New Mexico and Arizona territories. "And Ridge?" He looked up at Sarah with an expression of amazement. "Sarah, I think Rising Dawn was Major Ridge's granddaughter." Emma clapped her hands together in delight. "That means Sarah is my cousin," she exclaimed. James was studying a family tree that Sarah had constructed from her research. "If this is correct," he said slowly, "then you and Emma are fourth cousins. You're both descended from Major Ridge, just through different children." Sarah felt dizzy as the implications sank in. She had risked her life to save a child who, it turned out, was her own distant cousin. The connection she had felt to Emma during the fire, the sense of familiarity in the little girl's eyes, suddenly made sense in a way that seemed almost supernatural. "Why would my family have hidden their Cherokee heritage?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. James's expression grew serious. After the Trail of Tears, and especially after the Dawes Act broke up tribal lands, many Cherokee families scattered. Some went to cities where they could blend in with other populations. Being Native American in the early 1900s meant facing discrimination, limited opportunities, and constant pressure to assimilate. Many families decided it was safer to claim Mexican or Spanish heritage. Emma had been listening intently to this conversation, and now she spoke up with the wisdom that had impressed Sarah from their first meeting. "So Sarah's family and our family both come from the same great-great-grandfather, but her family had to pretend they weren't Cherokee?" "That's exactly right," James confirmed. "It's actually a very common story." So, thousands of Cherokee descendants are living all over the Southwest and California, descended from families who left Indian Territory after allotment and never looked back. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with James to trace both family lines and confirm their connection. They discovered that Major Ridge had had several children, and that Rising Dawn had been the daughter of one of his sons who had moved west in the 1870s. She had married Juan Santos, a man of mixed Spanish and Cherokee heritage, and they had established a ranch in New Mexico Territory. Their daughter, Maria Santos, had eventually made her way to Oklahoma during the Great Depression, where she had met and married Sarah's great-grandfather. But she had never told her family about their Cherokee heritage, apparently believing that it was better left in the past. "Your great-great-grandmother, Rising Dawn, was considered Cherokee royalty just like Emma," James explained as they worked through the family connections. "She would have been raised with the same cultural knowledge and responsibilities that we're trying to pass on to Emma." Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Not only was she Cherokee, but she was descended from the same leaders and cultural carriers that Emma represented. The beadwork medallion that Emma had made for her took on new significance as Sarah realized. It connected her not just to Emma's family, but to her own heritage. "I want to learn everything," Sarah told James during one of their research sessions. "I want to learn about Cherokee culture and history and traditions. I feel like I've been missing a huge part of who I am." James smiled at her enthusiasm, but also offered a word of caution. "Cultural identity isn't just about bloodlines," he said gently. "It's about community and shared experiences and ongoing relationships with other Cherokee people. You have the ancestry, but building a real connection to Cherokee culture will take time and commitment." Emma, who had been working on a new beading project while the adults talked, looked up with a suggestion that would change the trajectory of Sarah's journey. "Why doesn't Sarah come to the Cherokee Nation Cultural Center with us next weekend? They have classes on Cherokee history and language and traditional arts." The visit to the Cherokee Nation Cultural Center in Tahlequah was a revelation for Sarah. She met Cherokee artists, historians, and cultural teachers who welcomed her warmly when they learned about her newly discovered heritage. She enrolled in a Cherokee language class and began learning about traditional Cherokee arts and crafts. Most importantly, she began to understand that being Cherokee wasn't just about her ancestry, but about participating in an ongoing community of people who shared cultural values and traditions. She learned about Cherokee concepts of balance and harmony, about the importance of clan relationships, and about the Cherokee emphasis on education and cultural preservation. Emma became Sarah's cultural mentor, teaching her basic Cherokee words and helping her understand the significance of different traditional practices. Despite their age difference, Emma's deep grounding in Cherokee culture made her an ideal guide for Sarah's journey of cultural discovery. "In Cherokee tradition, we believe that everything happens for a reason," Emma told Sarah one day as they worked together on a beading project. "I think the fire happened so that you could find your way back to your Cherokee family." James nodded at his granddaughter's words. Emma might be right. Cherokee people believe in the interconnectedness of all things. Maybe you were meant to save Emma so that you could also save your own connection to Cherokee culture. As spring arrived, and James and Emma prepared to move into a new house that insurance money and community fundraising had made possible, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that October evening when she had seen smoke rising from a house on Maple Street. She had begun the year as Sarah Martinez, paramedic, a woman who thought of herself as Mexican American, with a straightforward personal history. She was ending it as Sarah Martinez, Cherokee descendant, a woman connected to a rich cultural heritage and an ongoing community of people who shared her ancestry and values. The new house that James and Emma moved into was designed to accommodate their extended family, including Sarah. James had insisted on including a small apartment space where Sarah could stay when she visited, which had become increasingly frequent as she deepened her involvement in Cherokee cultural activities. "You saved Emma's life," James told Sarah as they worked together to set up the new house. "But in doing so, you also saved your own connection to your Cherokee heritage. Emma and I consider you family now, not just because we share ancestors, but because you've chosen to become part of our community." Emma, now 9 years old and more confident than ever, had become something of a local celebrity in Cherokee cultural circles. Her story of being rescued by her long-lost Cherokee cousin had captured people's imagination, and she was frequently invited to speak at cultural events about the importance of Cherokee family connections. "I always knew there was something special about Sarah," Emma would tell audiences, wearing traditional Cherokee clothing and speaking with the poise of someone much older. "Even before we knew we were cousins, I could tell she had Cherokee spirit. Cherokee people always recognize each other." Sarah's transformation from reluctant hero to Cherokee cultural student had been gradual but profound. She had learned to speak basic Cherokee, had mastered several traditional crafts, and had become an active participant in Cherokee community events. More importantly, she had found a sense of cultural identity and belonging that she hadn't even realized she was missing. The beadwork medallion that Emma had made for her after the fire had become Sarah's most treasured possession. She wore it to Cherokee cultural events and community gatherings, where it served as a visible symbol of her connection to Cherokee tradition and her relationship with Emma's family. "This medallion represents more than just protection," Sarah would explain to people who asked about it. "It represents the moment when I found my way home to my Cherokee heritage, and the moment when Emma and I discovered we were family." 2 years after the fire, Sarah was invited to speak at the Cherokee Nation's annual Heritage Month celebration about her journey from rescue hero to Cherokee cultural participant. As she stood before an audience of several hundred Cherokee people, wearing traditional clothing and the beadwork medallion that had started her cultural journey, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. "I thought I was just doing my job as a paramedic when I climbed that ladder to rescue Emma," she told the audience. "I had no idea that I was also climbing toward my own Cherokee heritage and my own cultural identity. Emma didn't just teach me about Cherokee culture, she taught me about myself." Emma, now 10 and preparing to participate in her first traditional Cherokee stomp dance, sat in the front row beaming with pride at her cousin's speech. After Sarah finished speaking, Emma joined her on stage to demonstrate traditional Cherokee beadwork techniques. "Sarah saved my life," Emma told the audience, "but I think I saved hers too. She was lost from her Cherokee family, and I helped her find her way back. That's what Cherokee people do. We take care of each other." The audience erupted in applause, not just for the heartwarming story, but for the living example of Cherokee values that Sarah and Emma represented. They had demonstrated the Cherokee principles of kinship responsibility, cultural preservation, and community support in the most dramatic way possible. As Sarah and Emma left the stage together, the medallion catching the light and sparkling with the same fire that had first brought them together, Sarah realized that her identity had been completely transformed by that October night when she had seen smoke rising from a stranger's house. She had begun that evening as an individual acting alone to help someone in need. She was ending as a Cherokee woman connected to centuries of cultural tradition and an ongoing community of people who shared her values and her commitment to helping others. The girl she had risked everything to save had turned out to be Cherokee royalty, but more importantly, she had turned out to be the key to Sarah's own royal Cherokee heritage. Their rescue story had become a Cherokee community legend, a modern example of how Cherokee people find and take care of each other even across generations of separation and cultural loss. Emma had been right from the beginning. Everything had happened for a reason, and that reason was the preservation and continuation of Cherokee family connections that transcended individual lives and connected past, present, and future in an unbroken chain of cultural identity and mutual responsibility.